Steve, now the next session, Steve's going to speak until about just before 10 to maximum on European democracy and the European Revolution, and then we'll have time for questions, discussion, and then we'll move on to the third and final session. So, is that okay with everybody? Steve?
Try and talk for less even if I can. The way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to use a few PowerPoints up here and then just talk around those. So I'm trying to minimise the number of PowerPoints, but I've got quotes and things that you might need to have up there. I should just say that my position is I'm a sort of remain abstainer. I'm not talking about that. So that's what's going to come up in the third session. I just mentioned that. I'm more concerned is after the referendum is kind of, well, what next? Because after the referendum's taken place, we're going to either be in or out, and what that could mean depends on all sorts of factors that we can't, I'm not going to discuss now. But so I'm more concerned about where are we going to be next year, the next 5 years, or the next 10 years. Because I think if we're going to talk about where we stand today, we need to have a view of the future. Where is the future going? And it does hide behind everything that we have been saying. So my first PowerPoint would be this one. Here's Boris Johnson says some interesting things despite being everything we can say against him. But he said in one of his speeches, do you want to live in a country called Europe? For which of course he said absolutely no way. We've really got to definitely not let that happen to us. And he sort of added a little bit to it by saying, I mean, I might answer that yes, actually, probably. We have a few qualifications to it, but anyway.
On his list.
He said the EU has changed beyond all recognition, and that there is a continuing. So he's talking about a continuing and accelerating effort to build this country called Europe. So he's talking about the plans out there somewhere that he sees. And so what he's doing in this, of course, he's raising not just a reference, he's raising a reason to leave, by the way, by talking about where the longer term future of where we're actually going. And that's a reason he says to leave. So I was thinking about this, and I come up with the Euro monster. Okay, the Euro monster, because I think the Euro monster, and I thought Frankenstein was pretty good. Mary Shelley would have had something to think about this, because probably the left and the right probably have various versions of this, and I think that's one. So, you know, Boris Johnson could be talking about the Euro monster, whatever language he was using. We on the left, you know, see all the problems with where Brussels actually is. So we have some version of that, okay, analysis of that as well. I don't think the difference between the remains and abstains and the leavers is really about necessarily the nature of the regime. You may disagree with that, and I can see Adrian probably will do, but I think also that in a sense you've all got to remember behind that is this: we've got the alliance between France and Germany, and you've got the UK. So a lot of this discussion really is about the interrelationships between these nation states. I heard that Germany today was appealing for Britain not to leave, because originally, of course, you had an alliance between France and Germany was the basis of the European Union until the 1970s, probably till the 1980s, when Thatcher really got Britain involved in the Single European Act, as Paul mentioned that up front. So, should we really be talking about the Euro monster, or should we be talking about the fact that we really have nation states running this thing from behind this Euro monster? And we might see the monster, but what's actually standing behind it? What's the real power behind it? And indeed, what's the real power behind that as well? One can go to that. So I thought I would start a discussion and maybe ask you a little bit about this. My starting point, I think, would be the triad. So I think one could have a bit of a discussion around this. Now, in the 1980s, the triad used to refer to the United States and the EEC, and the third one was Japan. I always remember this idea of the triad, and it was Japan. Because Japan has completely gone out of the picture, it's been stagnating for a long time. And what's appeared on the scene now has been China. So I think in any understanding of the European Union, I think you've got to think of our relationship to the United States, our relationship to China. And so if we put Britain in here somewhere, come on up. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, come back too. I was going to say that just some figures at the top. The top one up there is 2007. In 2007, the European Union became the biggest economy in the world. It had a $14.4 trillion economy. And for the first time, it had picked America with $13.3 trillion. And China at that time only had $7 trillion economy, it was half the size of those two. If you come up to 2015, and it's interesting that the European Union stayed in front until 2013 when America came back on top again. And if you ask why was that, it's because when you look at the impact of the economic crisis, it had a much more damaging impact on the European Union than it did on America. And there's some real reasons why that is the case. But Europe was the biggest, then it lost its position to America, and then as you see now, China has come out as the biggest economy in the world. Now, of course, there are massively different sizes of populations down here. So when we start to talk about productivity, which we could talk about, by the way, the American productivity is still by far the highest compared to the European Union or China. Down here, if we look at some of the latest figures in terms of economic growth, the EU has just started to recover. Its growth rate is now 1.5%, according to the economists this is, and they've just revised it up to 1.7%. America, US is 1.8% and China 6.5%. So China is still continuing to grow more rapidly than anywhere else. But everybody's worried because it was coming down from 8 or 9%. So China's growth rate has been falling, but it still means that China is kind of out-competing. Now we could have a discussion, and here we've got unemployment, another set of figures. Unemployment in the EU is 10.2%, in America it's 5%, and in China it's about 4%. So you can see that unemployment is also a bigger issue in the European Union. And when you start to break those figures down, as we did before, it's quite uneven, is the level of unemployment as was being mentioned before. For example, Greece 24%, Spain 20%, France 10%, Italy 11%, Poland 9% are at one end of that spectrum. So the thing about the European Union is these factors are actually quite uneven within the framework. So the European Union has got much more unevenness in its economic development. Now we could discuss how we might describe these. You know, I would take China as a kind of state capitalism, much more centralised economy compared to America at the other extreme. So we could discuss them at that level. And my question mark, by the way, in here was Britain. Okay, which way is Britain going in these three? Now, you know, we have traditionally been the 50. I would say you could argue that Britain has been traditionally the 51st state of America, and even its relationship with the European Union has always been seen by America as being a kind of Trojan horse on the inside of the European Union, which is why Obama and all the American want us to stay in for that reason. You could see the argument of the European Union is actually an argument, should we, not actually between whether Britain can be independent or not, the way it's conducted, should we be in the European Union or shall we be independent is the way it's popularly conducted. But it may be an argument between whether we should be in with America or should be in the European Union. It could be an American argument which isn't coming out at all, you know. So there's a whole thing about our relationship with America. And then, interestingly enough, when you look in the City of London, it's the case that the City of London is also a little bit divided. Most of the banks want to remain in the European Union, and you can understand why that is. But the hedge funds, on the other hand, are supposedly, the hedge funds are more for out. So there is a division within the city, although the majority are clearly for in. The hedge funds, well, what's that about? Because the hedge funds tend to see themselves as global. And there's a whole idea being developed that a strategy for British capitalism might be more towards China or more towards the Far East. So in a way, the longer term thinking is about the relationships between these three. So that'd be one thing we might be able to discuss and we might be able to comment on. Okay, next point is this. I'll move on. I'll go backwards. Okay, European Revolution. Okay, so I wanted to argue that in fact there was a kind of economic revolution that has been going on in the last 10 years. And I would call it an integrationist revolution. I might use that term. Because what's been happening over the last 10 years, or maybe longer than that, is that the British economy has become much more integrated into the European economy. Now, obviously, this is a capitalist revolution because the driver of this revolution has been the development of capitalism. It's the argument, really, that in order to be able to compete with America and China, we must have a much more rationalised European Union. That the fragmentation, the disaggregation doesn't really work in terms of developing effective capitalism. You know, if you're going to sell your washing machines just in a little market of 62 million people, that's different from selling your washing machines all over Europe on a common framework. And of course, what the European Union is about partly is also standardising laws and conditions so that you have a large market. So there's another argument here about the difference between large capitalist states and small states. Capital prospers in larger states. And I think that's an argument for this particular process. Now, I'm not speaking as a socialist, I'm just commenting on what's taking place. I'm not saying I'm in favour of this or not in favour of it. I think Ireland, I think Joe will tell us where this is right, I think Ireland has been changed. You can look at Ireland actually and see a massive change that's taken place in Ireland since it has become part of the European Union. If you look back in Ireland 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's almost a completely different place now. In the past, Ireland was very much tied as an agricultural country, supplying England. Everything, most of the things, its economic relations were with England, and still are to some extent. But Ireland has been transformed by being in the European Union in terms of, because it's attracted, by the way, lots of foreign capital. And if you think about the kind of country Ireland was, and again, Joe will tell us about it, the kind of country Ireland was 10 or 20 years ago and what it is now, it has been transformed. I looked at the top 10, and this was interesting. I did look at the top 10 Euro brands to see what they were. It turned out that, and I won't run over all of them because time won't allow me to do that. How are we doing time-wise?
You've got 8 minutes.
8 minutes to go. Okay, I won't go over all of them. I just listed them in the paper, but I won't say that. Now, looked over the top brand. The first one was one I'd never heard of, and you've heard it, called LVMH. Have you heard of LVMH? Well, I haven't. It's a French company, and it's Louis Vuitton, Moet, and things like that. They do those luxury goods. They're number one European company. Nestlé Swiss is 2, and after it's Vodafone, you know, the Belgian brewers, Unilever, etc., etc. I looked all the way down the list for the top 10 companies. The UK's got 3, Germany's got 3, France has got 1, Spain has got 1. If you look to the top 10 global companies, what you see in the top 10 global companies are 9 American companies and 1 Chinese company. And the interesting thing when you compare the two lists is the top 3 American are Apple, Google, Microsoft. And so you realise that there's nothing like that in the list of European companies. And so when you actually look at it, Europe is actually quite well behind in terms of high technology. And all the reports tell us that. So just comparing those two lists, you can sort of start to see something about the economy. Next one, foreign direct investment. The real driver of this has been foreign direct investment, of this revolution. Foreign direct investment. And the UK, by the way, has been a major recipient of foreign direct investment. That's foreign businesses investing in the UK. We're third only to the US and China in receiving this foreign direct investment. And the estimated stock of foreign direct investment in this country now is £1 trillion, about half of which has come from other EU countries. So there has been a significant involvement of European investment in the UK. 3 sectors. Yes, I think if we're thinking about the debate that's going on, you can think of the economy as in 3 sectors. The domestic sector, like the small shops who are just selling locally. There's a European sector, and then there's a kind of global sector. And when you start to see how capital divides over what to do, it actually depends where they are within those sectors. By and large, there's a correspondence. Those businesses trading with Europe are more in. Those companies are thinking globally and tend to be more out, and the domestic sector doesn't see any particular point in it because it doesn't necessarily directly affect them. So there is a correspondence. And then, of course, you've got the idea of free movement. One of the other big factors, of course, in this revolution, this integrationist revolution, has been the movement of people. I'll run out of time before being able to go into that. I've got all the figures, but it just turned out, I'll give you a couple, that we've got in this country 521,000 Poles, 398,000 Irish people, 290,000 Germans, which surprised me. I didn't think there was that many Germans in the country. I knew about, we've got a lot of French in London, because they say that London is the 7th largest French city, with 116,000 there, 113,000 Italians. I could go out on the list, but I won't, but all the numbers are there. So this integration is at the level of labour and the working class. There's a whole integrationist process going on that's tying these economies absolutely together. Our fate is really tied together, which means that getting out of it is much more kind of problematic. That doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't, but it's just that I won't do trade, but I will do one other thing. It's my own favourite thing. So, are we all Europe? We are all Europeans now. I mean, I don't know whether people call themselves. I mean, as a communist, you might say, I don't have any country. I'm a citizen of the world. You might say that. Whether you would say you're from England, the UK, or all those things. But I wonder how many people call themselves Europeans. I tend to sort of sometimes say that, and a lot of people do, but we never used to do that. And so I'm wondering, have we been having a cultural revolution in our food, in our habits, in our behaviours, etc., etc.? And you might want to think about that. Something that's going along in the way we relate. It has been changed in the last... And young people would catch up on that as well much more easily than we would. I had my own favourite one, which was Leeds United. I was a Leeds United fan. I looked at the famous team from the 1970s. I looked at the membership, all famous players. Every single one of them is an English, Scottish, or Welsh person, or Irish. There's one Irish, Johnny Giles, in there. That was a time when Matt Busby was the manager of Manchester United, Joe Mercer was the manager of Manchester City, Liverpool had Bill Shankly, and we could talk about all those teams at that time. And I think, well, today, Leeds United is owned by a mad Italian. Liverpool is managed by Jurgen. You do, and he is. And anyway, Jurgen Klopp's the manager of Liverpool, Manchester United's Jose Mourinho, Man City's Pep Guardiola, Everton is Roberto Martinez.
No, he's fired.
He's fired, and they've got another European, another Dutchman.
Ronald Koeman.
Yeah, Ronald Koeman. Yeah, that's right. Him, and then Arsenal's managed by Arsene Wenger. The Premier League champions Leicester's Claudio Ranieri. The Salvin Bilic from West Ham is, I'm not sure if he's Croatian or Serbian.
Croatian,
right. Okay. Chelsea was managed by Gus Hiddink, but I don't know if it is now. Rafa Benitez is at Newcastle. Van Gaal was the manager, the Dutch was the manager of Manchester United, and Quinn Sanchez Flores was at Watford. So even at the level of our national sport, there has been a transformation taking place under our noses. So my thesis is that although this is a capitalist revolution and a capitalist kind of cultural evolution to go with it, we are being Europeanized despite whatever we might see or think. It's something which is actually happening. So that's my kind of next point. We can dwell upon that, whether that's true or not. My next point was Europe divided. I was just thinking about the big thing about Europe.
1 minute 50
1 minute 50. Okay, right. I was going to do three things European divided. One was the Eurozone. That's one big division happening. And people saying that the Eurozone is going to be the future of Europe after this takes place. Another division was this one, which is a north-south divide. Haven't got time to dwell on the figures. I will move on, we can come back. That's their debt to GDP ratios. The heavily indebted country, debt to DP, that's how indebted, that's a measure of their indebtedness. All the indebted countries are in the south, all the more less indebted countries are in the north. So there is a kind of north-south divide, and one I don't have any information on, but it's probably the most important of a lot. Of course, you've got the capital-labour divide as well. No figures on that, but we could find. So I think there are three kinds of divisions interacting within the European Union. There's a capital-labour one, there's a north-south one, and there's an EU, non-EU division. And the thing about divisions is it's something which is likely to move us on. So the next one was, oh, right, okay, the Panzer banks, okay. That was an article about how Germany, and that was how the German banks have been taking over the European Union through the single currency, the shadow state, the troika, etc., etc. And a figure about financial support, because there was an argument here that one of the differences between the European Union and those countries outside is that the European Union is a very strong vehicle for austerity, because there is basically no real democracy acting upon the political leaders of this state, so there's no way out. So the EU made available 3% of its GDP to support indebted countries. The UK, it was 25%, America was 20%. So you can see that the EU is much harder in enforcing austerity, and there's not really anything that one can do about it. Can I give myself another...
One point.
One point.
You're 20 minutes past.
Can I have 3 more minutes just to continue on? Okay.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay.
Well,
I put a dreadnought down there because I didn't want to forget about the City of London.
2 minutes starting now.
Okay, right. United States of Europe. I was going to quickly flash over people's discussion about this. We've got Winston Churchill, we've got Leon Trotsky. John talked about this in a couple of articles that he was writing. Lenin and others were writing about the United States of Europe. Nigel Lawson said, the United States of Europe, we definitely don't want to have it. Here's a commissioner, talked about the United States of Europe. I want to argue that the United States of Europe is the only logical extension of this process. Nobody wants it, but it's the only way that we can get out of this. Now, of course, there can be many. So I've got this idea where this is my sort of story. Here we go. And get to here. I've got a line going from independent states through the European Union, through the Eurozone, through a crisis, and the possibility of coming out of that crisis with something like that. Not that it's there yet, but it's talked about as a logical extension. Everybody understands what the United States is because of the United States of America. It doesn't mean we're going to copy America, by the way, because there can be different kinds of United States. It depends what people have. And so we're at this kind of point here. We've got Greece, we've got migration, we've got Brexit, we've got refugees. So we've got this point of crisis. And so you might have an analogy of saying that the water's heated up to 99 degrees centigrade. If it tips over from water into steam, that's the point of some kind of revolution. Because if we don't do that, we're going back in the opposite direction. So we can go in 2 directions. Backwards towards independent states, or forwards to a United States of Europe. And my last point, I think, is would be how might that come about? We'll finish on this point. Trotsky talks about this in 1915. He says there's only 3 ways that Europe can be united. He's talked about the unity that in the middle of the First World War, which is a massive disaster for European civilization and culture. He says it can be united by force. The Germans might win the First World War at that time. That was one. Or there could be, he said, a capitalist negotiated union. In other words, the ruling classes of Europe get together and they try to do it by some set of treaties and negotiations. The elite do it, which of course is which is in fact what's happened. And then he says, well, it can come from below by means of a popular democratic revolution, the people power idea. And of course, Trotsky saw the Russian Revolution as being the potential launchpad for this happening as a Russian democratic revolution. But obviously those are different ways. As a socialist and communist, we're not going with the first 2, we're going with that one. And as an analogy, I'll finish with it. As an analogy of this, if you think about the unification of Germany in the 19th century, 32 states made up Germany in the 19th century. These 2 ways were there. In 1848, there was a democratic revolution in Germany that possibly could have united Germany. Didn't it fail? It was defeated. But there was possibility of a democratic Europe happened at that point. They were defeated by counter-revolution. As a result of that counter-revolution, 10 years later, 15 years later, 1866, I think it was 1870, Germany was united by blood and iron, by Bismarck, by Prussian army taking over Germany and uniting Germany that way. We have lots of examples.
And
of
invading
that
France
way.
as well. If you've done
And
that.
invading France as well, and creating the Paris Commune as a result
Okay.
of that.
Thanks,
So
Steve.
we're finished there.
Okay, so when do you want to go on to? Tweet. Steve, what Steve said, Bobby?
Since Marina isn't here for me to piss her off, I'm going to have to piss you off,
Okay.
Steve, instead.
Good.
You know, what I've found from both presentations, I thought they were very pessimistic, take no account of the crisis within capitalism at the moment. As an economy, capitalism is just staggering, not knowing where it's going from day to day. The fact that there's a lot of right-wing movements erupting throughout Europe is the kind of indication that capitalism can't rule in their old way. But I think what's most disappointing about the presentations is the failure to recognise that, on the whole, there are numbers of people throughout the world who hate what's going on, and if we only were to look, we can see that they're bubbling up out of nowhere. They're not bubbling up from within existing parties. So the squares by night in France, the anti-water privatisation in Ireland, the way young people reacted to Corbyn challenging for the leadership in this country, they're all symptoms of new forces that are arising, and we don't have to adapt to capitalism that is crumbling. We need to be looking to new forces and building alliances, and the idea that we can build alliances within the EU is fantastical. We need to build these alliances from these new people that are arising everywhere. And that's our future, not a different rearrangement of capitalist relations in Europe.
You want to
Yeah.
You want to speak? Yeah. You and yeah.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, I don't think Steve was actually sort of fetishising the EU. I mean, to me, I'm an old-fashioned communist, and Lenin was, for example, I think, a world revolutionary. It didn't mean that when he looked at the Russian Empire, he said, I won't operate within the Russian Empire. And I think that's all that Steve's saying. So, it's a bit like, I'm not going to operate in the UK because it's anti-democratic and it's got a queen. Well, operate somewhere else then. I mean, this planet is dominated by capitalism. I cannot opt out. So that's just the first thought on it. But I really want to question your opening statement. Right? You said, sort of paraphrasing, June the 24th, we wake up and either we're in or we're out. Well, I think that's utterly delusional. I think we wake up, whatever the result is, on the 24th, we will stay in. I say we, Britain will stay in. Right? That's it. So, for all the reasons you say, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? So, that's why I think this referendum's a farce. Okay, it's a good time to discuss and all the rest of it. But whoever wins, Britain will stay in the EU. And Paul, you raised up, I'm sorry.
Why? Sorry, why? I don't understand.
Because for all the reasons he said, the global economy has integrated Britain in. How are you going to leave the EU? So, okay, so you're going to break all these... Boris Johnson has already said, just before he decided, by the way, to be an outer, oh, what about a second referendum? Comrades have already referred to Ireland getting it wrong. The people will get it wrong. And I tell you who will tell them they got it wrong, I'm guessing now, by the way, it will be someone called Clinton. Right? Hillary will tell Boris, if it's Boris, to come to Washington. He'll go there, he'll bow down, and she'll say, you got the wrong result. He'll say, well, I know I got the wrong result. This is what you've got to do. He'll go away and do it. He'll come back with a piece of paper, just like Harold Wilson came back with a piece of paper. Well, not Harold Wilson, it's Jim Callahan in 1975. But anyway, that's my real point, Steve. So just finally on that, I don't believe that we've got the USA, EU and China as some sort of three imperialist blocks that are rivals to each other. To me, the United States is in charge. And that's why, in terms of de Gaulle saying non, right, it was because he knew that Britain would bugger up a united Europe of Germany and France, right? And it's done it. It's got all of Eastern Europe in, and look at the mess that they produce. So, to me, you've still got the United States at the top, and that architecture of global capitalist power relationships, whatever you vote or whatever I vote on the 23rd, that remains, right? And it's that we need to overthrow. And we can only overthrow it, in my view, if we, the working class, come to power in something like Europe, because that could stand up to the United States. Coming to power in Greece, I mean, really coming to power, we'd just get slaughtered. Anyway, that's enough.
Thank you. Yeah. And then you.
I've got some questions, really, very short, about the dynamic processes and thinking about things in a more dialectical way. I've got three things to say. Firstly, you had a map and asked what's the power behind the EU, and your answer was countries. Yeah? But who writes the legislation for the EU? It comes primarily from the European Roundtable of Industrialists. They set the agenda for the Commission then tells the states what they're going to do. So of course, states are important for a variety of reasons, but we mustn't leave out big capital rather than states. So we need a theorisation of that, because if we've got two contradictory sovereignties clashing, the sovereignty of private property, hands off, it's mine, and the sovereignty of states, only one of them could we ever influence in an electoral process. And if capital's sovereignty has trumped states, then that's another reason for questioning how you go about changing anything. That's the first point. The second point, you said there's an integrationist revolution, but dialectically speaking, there's also a disintegrationist revolution, and the two go together. Eastern Europe has joined, and now what's happening in Eastern Europe and Greece and so on. The third point is when you said that the United States of Europe is the only logical future. Well, capitalism isn't logical. And actually, lots of capitalist countries, Scotland nearly a year or so, a couple of years ago, South Sudan, East Timor, the breakup of Eastern Europe, Czech Republic and the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and so on. We've got more and more states coexisting within this globalised world. So it's a dialectic of in and out of what an international relations scholar called the national global dialectic, which is persistent. And I think we need to not think that there's a logical future, but one we have to fight for. No, I have shut up.
No, there's only been two so far, Steve. Joe, you want to speak?
No, we had three because we had Robbie first.
Oh yeah, okay. We're going to come back to you, the rest of you in a second. Steve, just
otherwise I'll get lost in too many stuff, so just brief comments. I actually thought, Robbie, that in a way you were being rather pessimistic. My thing isn't pessimistic. Mine is saying that there is an answer to this, which is other than the breakup of the whole thing into a kind of reactionary disaster. It's actually a democratic move forward. And that's the only way we can go, in a certain sense. So I don't think it's pessimistic. And of course, I haven't forgotten globalisation, although I only confined it to China, the EU, and America. John, I agree with what you said, John, and the reason I absolutely agree with that, and being an abstentionist myself, is everything is not gambling on this one result on there. I think actually it carries on. Personally, so I agree with both of your comments. On that. Well, the first one was on whether it will be decided on June the 20th. I know I said that, but I was trying to avoid having a proper discussion about the June the 23rd, what it meant. I forgot what the other point was. What was the other one?
Just the United States is really in charge.
Yes, and I agree with that as well. The United States is really in charge. And you're quite right, the United States got Britain to bring up a lot of the present things that come up from the incorporation of Eastern Europe into that process. And then the third one, Adrian, I agree with you. In fact, I sort of said that. Who's behind it? I had my Euro, I had my Frankenstein. Behind Frankenstein, I had Britain, Germany, and France. And then I did say behind that, who's behind them? Then there's another word behind that, and you're quite right. It's the, as you said, the capitalist, the European round table of businesses. So behind the states are the real capitalist forces. So it's a layered thing, isn't it? And we're trying to peel back the layers. What the right wing are doing are showing up the Euro monster and using that for their reactionary purposes, but where we're trying to peel back what's really going on behind it. You're quite right, logically, I said it's a logical future, a logical extension of capital accumulation that's taking place, but you're quite, I say, so I would say go with the flow, you know, it's strong if we go with the flow, but you're quite right, that isn't what's going to happen, because what's going to happen is what people will decide to do, you know, it's the people will make something happen. But I think that if you're trying to stand against, like King Canute, if you're trying to stand against the tide, you are not, it's not going to work. If you're going with the flow, then you can divert that flow, and that was the idea of the strategy. Go with the flow and divert it into a democratic direction, not the direction that might take it. And I think that was, yeah, that creative destructive, I think, yes. Capital is creative and destructive. The revolution is creating stuff while destroying a load of other stuff.
Yeah, Schumpeter. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in a few facts about the Irish situation. The country which will be impacted the most by the UK leaving the EU will be the Irish Republic. And there are two sides to this. I mean, one is that it's not well known that the UK's biggest trading partner, bigger than any trade with China or with Russia, is the Irish Republic. Actually has a bigger trade figure with the Irish Republic. And on the other side, despite the fact that the EU has influenced Ireland trade-wise, the UK is by far the Irish Republic's biggest trade partner. So the Irish government at the moment are busily dispatching ministers over here all the time at Irish events to try and get Irish citizens here to vote. You mentioned that there are roughly 400,000 here. I made a video last week for Another Europe is Possible, speaking as an Irish citizen and appealing to my fellow Irish citizens to vote to remain. There are two sides to the EU situation in Ireland. I mean, one is that I saw an economic historian's work recently in Dublin saying that, you know, in Ireland in the 60s it was actually still the poorest country in Europe. I mean, we were always taught at school that under Lamass, moving away from the De Valera isolationist model, Ireland began to really develop in the 60s. There's now increasing understanding that that didn't really happen. It wasn't until we joined the EU that actually transformed our economy. It was the EU that totally transformed our economy. And you can see that in terms of infrastructure, motorways, you know, various things like that. So there's always been a very strong attachment in Ireland towards the EU, and of course part of that is the historic relationship with moving away from England, moving away from being dependent on England, and that is going to be, you know, a big element in Irish thinking around the EU. But there's also, of course, the other side of the equation. You spoke about the North and the South. Ireland's very much a part of the South, an honorary member of the South. And I was reading recently that the indebtedness of the average per capita in Ireland is €9,000 per head, which is by far the highest figure in the whole of the EU, far higher than Greece, Spain, or anywhere else. And, you know, at least 50 years indebtedness as a result of this recent experience. So I think, you know, from our perspective, the Brexit is going to have a huge impact. I mean, I'm not even going to bring up the issue of peace agreement and the border and the position of the unionists and all of that, but just in purely in economic terms, we are very integrated into the EU economy, and there's increasing conversation in Dublin about could Ireland be the winner from this by having a lot of the banks, which need to be in an English-speaking country in the EU, moving to Dublin. Dublin is sort of, in some ways, you know, rubbing its hands and hoping that Brexit goes ahead because it may lead to a major move, but we don't know. I mean, there are two sides of the thing.
Thank you. Basil, did you want to say something?
Yes. I'm just trying to think how to put this. The idea that Steve has presented, and the colleague sitting in front of me, that somehow whether we vote to leave, we're still going to be in. And I think my point is, you'll correct me, is similar to what, in agreement with Robbie. I think to think dialectically, you've also got to think firstly of the unintended consequences. So there is an argument to say, but if you vote out Lexit, then somehow that is to bring yourself together with the Brexits who are voting for this rather idealized view of Europe, the return to the nation state. But that's not how I see it. Of course, there's no way you can return to this idealized past of the self-contained, lovely nation state. The idea of leaving Europe from a left-wing perspective is you want to deal a body blow to this neoliberal constituted Europe. Even you could use a similar argument for the Brexits. What the Brexits don't realize is that you can't break off the flows of trade, etc., etc. So they'll be but what they will be voting for, which meets a more left-wing position or approximates a more left-wing position in terms of unintended consequences, is it will deal this fundamental body blow to Europe. Because if you start from the premise that the EU, as it is constituted, is unreformable, in fact, it's a corrupting influence on anybody who seems to embrace its institutions, its environment becomes corrupted, as is indicated in the example of Greece. The only way of reforming Europe is to dismantle the institutions that make up the European Union. I'll just use one example. I want to use one example to perhaps try and demonstrate what I'm saying. Having been born and brought up and being an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, there was always an argument that apartheid, apart from its racist dimension, was nevertheless the logical expression of capitalism within South Africa. And you needed, in a way, you needed apartheid to develop the forces of production within the South African social formation. However, that structural, you might call it necessity, did not preclude the campaign to overthrow apartheid. So it's a similar sort of, there's a similar argument in what Steve's saying, in that the European Union is the sort of logical expression of economic development in terms of developing the contradictions, etc., but that doesn't preclude the need to transform it.
Thank you. Brennan.
Just quickly, I just think it's important to be clear that the EU and Europe are not the same thing.
Yes.
And a lot of people seem to think they are the same thing, but they're not. There was a Europe before the EU. The EU, as was explained, was formed in the post-war period, 1950s basically. So it's only been around for 70 years, 65 years. I mean, it's not like the end of the world or the beginning of the world. There was a world before the EU. That's a very important point, because people say, oh, we're going to lose all these wonderful things. Well, a lot of those wonderful things are not to do with just the European Union. I mean, you know, Greece had an Acropolis before the EU. And Beethoven composed the EU anthem long before the EU. So there is culture before and after the EU, and it's ridiculous to make this identification, which is constantly being made in order to terrify people and think, we'll lose all our friends if we leave. Oh, well, terrible, because we can only have them if we're in the European Union, which is simply not true. First, that's the second point. First, second point is that there is globalization without capitalism. There has been globalization without capitalism, and there could be globalization without capitalism in the future. So we don't have to lose the gains that we've made, like free movement of people, people having jobs in different countries, not just in the European Union, but globally. We don't have to lose that because we don't have capitalist globalization. And that's like the only thing people seem to think is possible. So I think it's important to make that statement. The third point is that what really happened, as we know, is people are leaving these old political parties in droves, in their millions. And we had the presentation about Syriza. Similarly in Spain, the Podemos movement. These movements rose because people rejected the old parties because they knew they couldn't operate through the old kind of democracy. And the new democratic movements have arisen, and that's all what I think Steve probably means partly by a democratic revolution, which is great. But let's look at what happened. Syriza decided they could influence and reform the European Union. It turned out not to be possible. Same with Podemos, they kind of abandoned a lot of their grassroots strategies and became part of the system in Spain. So surely the lesson from that is, how do you avoid that trajectory back into the system, which is what's happened to these movements? And that's, I think, what I understand by democratic revolution is that how do we, how we can develop these movements that have arisen and that will continue to rise and that are still there, despite the horrors of the racist and fascist movements that we see. But just to look at that one side of it is very, very misleading. Thank you.
I just want to make a point. Did you want to make a point,
Yeah,
Steve?
no,
And then we have to finish, because June the 23rd will be upon us and we'll still be here. It's going to be bad news. I agree that you have to look at it more dialectically, this process, and also the consequences of June the 23rd, because you can't say that if Britain vote, whichever way it goes, it's going to be a very close vote, it won't be the same. There'll be a big political crisis, and there will be disruption, according to all the World Trade, the IMF, all anticipate a massive economic disruption and financial disruption, and given the state of the global economy, which is still heavily indebted and leveraged, and nowhere has growth at all returned, and all the money that's been created by central banks has been used to fuel stock market speculation and all the rest of it. There is no recovery from 2007. There isn't. And external jolts to the system, subprime type, we don't know. There are the known unknowns here are quite big. So I can't say the world will be the same after June 23rd. It won't be. And in some way, and this referendum is an expression. It's not just a Tory on Tory thing. It is an expression of a big crisis about sovereignty and constitutions and democracy. Okay, framed within their terms, but also in reaction to a huge disenchantment amongst large sections of the population. Some of it progressively expressed, some of it not. Expressed in Scotland. Very much and a desire to have some control. I was very struck yesterday. I spoke to someone who was a professional, small, technological-minded business. He's got a very left-wing person. He said, "I'm proud." He said, "I'm sick of being told what to do, either by this government or by the European government. I'm just sick of being told that this is what we're going to be doing." A very crude expression that he wants some kind of, and he thinks, of course, voting out will bring him more control. Not necessarily the case, but this is what's going on the ground. But as to the logic of this integration, I don't, and as to whether the United States is in control, I wouldn't say that. I think we have a globalized economy with its own objective reality and a global financial system, which not very few people actually, you could say, are in control. Someone said capitalism is not a logical system. It's a system of anarchy in some respects, which produces results, results which are not what they are intended to be. No one planned a financial crash. No one. Least of all the Americans. But hell, they were at the centre of it, weren't they? Lehman Brothers and all the rest of it. So I think we're in a very contradictory, quite transitional period of history we should be looking at here. It's not the old just rumbles on in a new form. People are looking for new forms, and capitalism may run out the democratic form. So, Steve, sorry, we've got you carry on.
Just very briefly, I'll try to sum up. Obviously, this has gone into the next debate. I'll try to avoid going into the next debate, but I'll make a couple of points. For us, for unintended consequences of things that happen. You know, this is the idea, this explosion that could happen if we break out that. I'm thinking about 9/11 when somebody flew a plane into this New York building, blew a hole in it, and people said, that's a fantastic blow against imperialism. Some people thought that, you know, etc., etc. What happened next? What happened next was the Iraq War, because the people with the power are the ones that are best organised to exploit any crisis and turn it to their own advantage. So if there is a Brexit blow-up of some kind, you know, who's going to exploit that most? I do believe, you know, John also pointed the direction that will happen. Things will happen, but it won't necessarily be the people's revolution, in my opinion, not necessarily at all. Karina, yes, Europe is not the same as the EU, but then the United States of Europe is not the same as the EU either. You know, it doesn't even necessarily, it could have some or different, it could even have Russia in the United States of Europe. I'm sure that Lenin and Trotsky thought that was possible. It's not within, no, it's not within our framework, and you wouldn't have it unless Russia had its own democratic revolution. Quite clear, that's not where we're at the moment. But the United States of Europe doesn't necessarily correspond simply with the borders of the EU. No, all I'm really saying is the process that's actually taking place gives the basis for there to be a European democracy. And I'll finish on this point, not that one. That's his programme for peace. That was my sort of final one. The European Union, democratic movement, bust through the crisis, the European Federal Republic, United States of Europe. That's the revolutionary road. It's not about reforming it's not actually about reforming the European Union, it's about transcending it. And the only people that can do that is the European working classes, while the Greek working class weren't unable to achieve it on their own. We have to have a European working class movement, and that's the only force that can democratise, I would say, the European Union. I'll finish there.
Okay, so we will finish. Thank you, Steve.